Good morning. Welcome to the First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist of Newburyport, Massachusetts. My name is Nancy Crocher, and I'm your worship associate today. This is my last time up here being a worship associate. I've enjoyed my time doing this. I'll be cycling off. I will still be worshiping with you. I will still be associating with you. I just won't be doing it from this lofty height anymore. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers and the grandfathers out there, and happy Juneteenth. We come together as a church community, online and in person, committed to love, peace, and justice. Our core values are authentic connection, courageous action, love, spirituality, and wonder. Our mission and our invitation to all of you is to come as you are, journey together in love, act with courage, transform our world. If you're visiting today or joining us for the first time, welcome. We're glad you're here. If you're joining us online, you'll find a link to the order of service in your reminder email or just below the live stream window. This morning, we're going to hear from two people about important initiatives happening locally in the state. We welcome David Detmold to our pulpit. David is the coordinator of ChangeTheMassFlag.com and the founding editor of the weekly independent newspaper, The Montague Reporter. Working in coalition with grassroots peace, racial justice, and indigenous-led groups, David has helped to organize successful town meeting and city council votes in support of changing the flag and seal of Massachusetts in 54 cities and towns from Provincetown to the Berkshires, and he's been doing this since 2018. He lives in Montague. We will also hear from FRS member Sid Rashke, who will be sharing information about an important Black History initiative here in Newburyport and how it arose out of her engagement with the church. I call your attention in the order of service to all the exciting things happening here. Please note that next Sunday's worship service is a pre-recorded service. It will be shown downstairs in the lower meeting house and can also be watched from your home on Zoom. Every Sunday, it's a blessing that we can gather, so let's give ourselves to it. Welcome once again. It's good to be together.
It is indeed good to be together. And I wanted to reiterate a very happy Father's Day to all who are fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and fathering people in various ways, and also a very happy Juneteenth and a happy summer as we move into those days and times ahead. This is an exciting year as we will have services through the summer in a more informal way, and yet how good it will be to be together. I'll be joining you for about half of those services, and we have wonderful guests and parishioners on the others. I wanted to start this morning's service by acknowledging that we are worshiping here today and every Sunday in a building that is constructed and standing on the unceded land of the Wabanaki Confederacy and of the Abenaki people. We honor them and all their indigenous relatives that are still here today. This flag was the flag of the state of Massachusetts that was hung in this sanctuary from this pulpit for many years. So as you're looking at that and hear from David this morning, understanding that this is that flag. Our call to worship this morning are words of celebration, affirmation, and commitment. We come to this place to worship together, recognizing strength in our diversity, committing to the freedom that comes from seeing the truth and speaking it. Here, we acknowledge that history is what actually happened, not necessarily what we are told. And covering over makes complicity commonplace, and power over keeps no one at peace. Therefore, transforming love is what is needed until freedom is for all, each and every one. You are joyfully called to worship.
Please join in the chalice lighting. Words while my family members light the chalice.
The words are printed in your order of service.
We gather this hour as people of faith,
Joys and sorrows, gifts and needs.
we light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together.
Each week, we also light 2 candles of peace, representing 2 places on earth we lift up and remember as a sacred encounter with our world. There are untold numbers of places on earth that need peace. These 2 we especially hold close in this service and through the week ahead. After each candle is lit, I will say, to this we respond, inviting you to join together in saying, peace, Sol, Shalom. Our first candle is lit for places and spaces all around where Juneteenth was celebrated this weekend and today, including Brown Square in Newburyport on Friday. We pray that the celebrations are followed by commitment and action that create a just, equitable, and free world for all people, especially Black people and people of color, to whom this has been far too long denied. To this we respond, peace, Sol, Shalom. And our second candle this morning is lit for homes and gatherings everywhere, where fathers, grandfathers, uncles, friends, and father figures are being celebrated, thanked, and remembered. We pray for all of you who father and who need fathering, that your strength will be used for healing, and your love will be given and returned in beautiful ways. To this we respond, peace, Sol, Shalom. Please rise in body or in spirit. Let's join in our opening hymn number 210, Wade in the Water.
Water,
Please be seated. Let us join in our affirmation of faith and doxology, and you can remain standing. The words are found in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Now you may be seated.
Good morning. I'm Sid Raschke, and this is the birth of the Black History Initiative. Last year, upon hearing the sermon given by Frank Cousins Jr., I was moved by the stories about his father, especially how Frank Sr. rose above prejudice with dignity. In subsequent virtual coffee hours, it was clear that my fellow church members proved we were motivated to get involved with the church's anti-racism initiative, but I wondered how best. A few weeks later, I attended Dr. Cabria Baumgartner's speech at a YWCA event. When the history professor encouraged people to update Newburyport's Black Heritage Trail, which was started about 20 years earlier, I had an epiphany. History. It dawned on me, documenting history is something our church could do well. By the way, I was the least qualified person to do this because history was not my favorite subject in school. And also, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and when I came here, I had no clue about this area's past, except for, of course, what we're taught in school about Plymouth Rock and so on. Nonetheless, with Frank Cousins' blessing and the support of my Seeing White group, others in the Anti-Racism Initiative, and of course, Reverend Rebecca, I began by revisiting the website of local historian Glee Woodworth. Glee had written an article about a former railroad bridge over Low Street called Guinea Bridge because of its proximity to a once vibrant neighborhood long ago with former slaves and current servants whose ancestors were from the Gulf of Guinea in Africa. The Guinea Bridge was later replaced by a pedestrian bridge, which is now part of the Clipper City Rail Trail. I sat bolt upright because I'm a member of the Coastal Trails Coalition. Our rail trails contain several educational panels, but not on the Low Street Bridge, despite Glee's expert research. Raring to rectify, I asked Jordy Vining, Newburyport's project manager, about the possibility of installing a sign. And it turned out Jordy was already researching Newburyport's Black history, and he agreed to look into the opportunity. I shared this good news with Dr. Baumgartner, and she volunteered to assist as needed, and eventually the three of us formed the Black History Initiative. While my focus was on the Guinea Bridge sign, Jordy and Cabria wanted to expand the scope, and we now are planning many such interpretive panels around the city featuring Black history from the time of maritime days to access to public schools to respected community members. For more about the initiative, you can check this week's Steeple Weekly for the link to the Newburyport Magazine article, and I think there's a few copies as you leave today in the vestibule. In terms of all of the egregious injustices inflicted upon people of color by early colonists and their descendants, including sadly today, installing Black history plaques seems somewhat insignificant. But if the history that we make accessible is fully reckoned with and representative, the foundation for future progress will have been made a little more sound. To that end, it would be ideal for our church to create a historical timeline of milestones. The progress would form quite an arc, beginning from early parishioners who tolerated slavery to today's anti-racism work. For example, we could document events or members of the FRS who were involved in the slave trade or who owned slaves, worked for the abolitionist movement, assisted or perhaps thwarted Black persons in purchasing their freedom, facilitated the Underground Railroad, worked via legal channels to ensure civil rights thereafter, educated local Black children, and other ways not mentioned. If any of these milestones interest you, or perhaps someone you might know, please get in touch with me or the church office. Your help in any way, large or small, would be greatly appreciated. It is my belief that the FRSUU can best foster change when we first hold ourselves accountable to our history. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. And I would say that naming the real history as it happened, having those signs up for all who are there and who come, who live here, who visit, who walk on those trails, is anything but insignificant. I applaud your efforts, and it is indeed true that it doesn't need masses of us to make these things happen. It's spectacular. I also encourage you all to listen to Sid's invitation to get involved in understanding our own history as we prepare to celebrate our 300th anniversary in the calendar year of 2025, really only a year and a half away, come September. And as we do that, creating a true documentation of our history is very, very important and will be critical to that time. We have next January a scholar from Penn State coming who's currently working on, and has been for a long time, a biography of Reverend Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who spoke here from this pulpit for a very brief period of time until his views against enslaved people brought the congregation to ask his departure. These are the truths we need to uphold and tell and know. The reading this morning is really more of an essay, and it is my delight and joy to offer this, both because Nikki Giovanni offers the most incredible way with words, and also because it demonstrates the importance of telling the truth of history, the importance that individuals can play. So I offer this in her words, entitled Rosa Parks, and it again is a tribute and a story. Rosa Parks. This is for the Pullman porters who organized when people said they couldn't, and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the Black Americans in the South so they would know they were not alone. This is for the Pullman porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight the fight that resulted in Brown v. Board of Education. Because even though Kansas is west, and even though Topeka is the birthplace of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote the powerful The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock, it was the Pullman porters who whispered to the traveling men, both the blues men and the race men, so that they both would know what was going on. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled as if they were happy and laughed like they were tickled when some folks were around, and who silently rejoiced when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently unequal. This is for the Pullman porters who smiled and welcomed a 14-year-old boy onto their train in 1955. They noticed his slight limp that he tried to disguise with a doo-wop walk. They noticed his stutter and probably understood why his mother wanted him out of Chicago during the summer when school was out. 14-year-old black boys with limps and stutters are apt to try to prove themselves in dangerous ways when mothers aren't around to look after them. So this is for the Pullman porters who looked over that 14-year-old while the train rolled the reverse of the blue highways from Chicago to St. Louis to Memphis to Mississippi. This is for the men who kept him safe. And if Emmett Till had been able to stay on a train all summer, he would have maybe grown a bit of a paunch, certainly lost his hair, probably have worn bifocals and bounced his grandchildren on his knee, telling them about his summer riding the rails. But he had to get off the train and ended up in Money, Mississippi, and was horribly, brutally, inexcusably, and unacceptably murdered. This is for the Pullman porters who, when the sheriff was trying to get the body secretly buried, got Emmett's body on the northbound train, got his body home to Chicago, where his mother said, "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." And this is for all the mothers who cried, and this is for all the people who said never again. And this is about Rosa Parks, whose feet were not so tired. It had been, after all, an ordinary day until the bus driver gave her the opportunity to make history. This is about Mrs. Rosa Parks from Alabama, who was also the field secretary of the NAACP. This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, was willing to sacrifice her life. So that young man in Money, Mississippi, who had been so well protected by the Pullman porters, would not have died in vain. When Mrs. Parks said no, a passionate movement was begun. No longer would there be a reliance on the law. There was a higher law. When Mrs. Parks brought that light of hers to expose the evil of the system, the sun came and rested on her shoulders, bringing the heat and the light of truth. Others would follow Mrs. Parks. 4 young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, would also say no. Great voices would be raised, singing the praises of God and exhorting us to forgive those who trespass against us. But it was the Pullman porters who safely got Emmett to his granduncle. And it was Mrs. Rosa Parks who could not stand that death. And in not being able to stand it, she sat back down.
The generosity of our community is an essential ministry that supports the work of the church both in Newburyport and beyond. Each week, 50% of the Sunday offering not designated as a pledge goes to a local community partner engaged in important efforts to help transform the region. In June, we support the LGBT Asylum Task Force in Worcester, which supports the basic human needs of LGBTQ people seeking asylum in the U.S. They depend on donations and volunteers to help asylum seekers. It takes approximately $1,200 per month to provide the basic necessities of shelter, food, and support for each asylum seeker. This past year, they supported 42 people fleeing persecution and maintained their 100% success rate of folks granted asylum compared to the less than 20% national rate. If you wish to give online, please use the link in your order of service or in the video description. You can also make a contribution via text message. Of course, you can always mail a check to the church as well. The offering will now be gratefully received.
We are blessed by one another. Each Sunday, we take time to lift up the joys and the sorrows of our beloved faith community. Reverend Helen Regida, our pastoral care associate, this morning will light candles as I read the joys and the sorrows that have been shared with me in advance of today's service. If you would like to share a joy or a sorrow to be read in the service, you can always send an email to betweenus@frsuu.org or directly to me. You can also write a joy or a sorrow in the journal that is located at the entryway into the sanctuary. This morning we light a candle of care and concern as Meryl Maleska Wilbur shares that her sister-in-law, Donna, the widow of Meryl's brother, came through surgery on a seriously infected foot last week. While the foot has been preserved, deep bone infection was discovered, and so several important bones needed to be removed, and more surgery may be eventually required. She is now undergoing 8 weeks of rigorous daily antibiotic infusions at a special clinic. She takes an elder van to and from the clinic in Burlington, Vermont. For the final decade of his life, Meryl's brother drove that van. The current drivers remember him well and speak of him fondly. Donna feels his presence daily, and that is a beautiful gift. Ray Wilson asks that we light a candle of joy as he is not only out of the hospital, but he is with us today after a harrowing week and I'll share what he wrote to me. A harrowing week, the subject line of which has said, "the sickest I've ever been." It was a week that a tick hadn't been discovered until it was deeply burrowed into his leg, which led to him collapsing last Sunday afternoon and being rushed to Exeter Hospital. He had a diagnosis of tick paralysis and anaplasmosis, a night of 105 degrees fever and hallucinations, huge amounts of doxycycline, and he is indeed glad to be back among so many cherished faces. We light a candle of love and blessed memory for Meg Wiley's mother-in-law, Helen Kuna, who passed away peacefully on Tuesday, June 14th, surrounded by her family. We also light a candle of concern for Jenny Ross, who contracted COVID while visiting her family in Milwaukee. There were serious ramifications. However, we are thrilled that she will fully recover and expects to be home soon, possibly today. And we light one final candle for all those joys and all those sorrows that, although unspoken, are held in just as much love and care. I invite you now to join together in a spirit of communal sharing, love, contemplation, quiet, reflection, and prayer. Spirit of life and of love, of all that is good and holy. We are so often overcome, tired, filled with remorse, sometimes pity for ourselves, sometimes feeling that who we are just isn't quite up to the job at hand. The needs overwhelming this world can feel overwhelming. The needs of a family member who is sick, struggling with addiction, troubled, alone. The loss of a loved one who perhaps died, moved away, has made choices that separated us. The pain in the world and the loss of lives unnecessarily from genocide in the past and in the present, from war, gun shootings, violence, the bullying, and it can go on and on. Hold those in pain. Let them know that there is a strength within them that is always there. Let them gain access to that strength. And so may we also be brave enough to turn to all that is good, all that is beautiful, all of the gifts of life. The loved ones we cherish who are alive and right here. The men who make sacrifices and love their families deeply. The fathers celebrated this day. The fathers to be. the fathers who were. The gift of a summer beginning again. In this beautiful, beautiful space that we are gifted to live upon, around, surrounded by the natural gifts of water, sky, earth, and air. May we be present enough to take those gifts into our heart, reminding us that as long as we are not overcome by the things that would hold us down, we can be bearers of peace. We can be agents of change. We can act in the name of love. For all of this and so much more, we say thank you and amen. Now I invite David to the pulpit with pleasure.
Thank you very much, Reverend Brian, and members of the congregation, for allowing me to speak here today. Quite some distance from my home in Montague on the Connecticut River, just south of Vermont. It's wonderful to be here. Out in the Berkshires, a little further west than where I live, in the small town of Sheffield, Colonel John Ashley purchased 2 young African girls in 1742 and kept them as slaves for nearly 40 years. when his wife tried to hit one of them with a heated kitchen shovel, her sister, Elizabeth Freeman, who came to be known to history as Mum Bet, intervened and took the blow herself. She walked off angry and found a sympathetic lawyer in Stockbridge and sued for her freedom. The year was 1780, and she had heard people talking about the revolutionary Massachusetts Constitution and its provision that all men are born free and equal. And I guess she decided that that applied to all women too. She won her suit in the county court, establishing a precedent that Quock Walker, an African man who had been enslaved and cruelly beaten by his owner, a man in Barry named Nathaniel Jennison, when he won his Massachusetts Supreme Court case on July 8th, 1783, establishing once and for all that the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and Constitution here in Massachusetts. July 8th, 1783, Quock Walker won his case, and within 10 years, the institution of slavery had died out in Massachusetts, not due to any act of the legislature, but due to this legal victory by Mum Bet and Quock Walker, a self-manumitted former African slave from Barry. On February 17th of this year, the state Senate here in Massachusetts approved a bill declaring July 8th Quock Walker Day, or Emancipation Day in Massachusetts. We are still waiting for the Massachusetts House to vote on that bill, S-2059. The news comes late. In her recent book on the origins of American slavery, Brethren by Nature, Margaret Ellen Newell writes, viewed through the lens of Indian slavery and forced servitude, New England looks less exceptional than previous scholarship has suggested. For indeed, the enslavement of native people had been endemic in Massachusetts since the Puritans landed in Shawmut Bay in 1630. And the lucrative trade in indigenous captives sold into slavery in the Caribbean to work and die in the notorious sugar plantations there, where mortality rates for slaves exceeded 50% per annum, formed a backbone of the new New England colony's mercantile wealth. In fact, in 1641, Massachusetts Bay passed the first slave law in the English Atlantic world, writes Newell, in large part because authorities wanted to define the legal status of the hundreds of Pequot Indian captives they had incorporated into their households. Indigenous slaves were the initial focus of John Eliot's evangelic project. First enslave them, then baptize them. The news comes late here in Massachusetts. We still teach our school children to honor the slave trader Christopher Columbus instead of honoring the indigenous people Columbus encouraged his crew to kidnap into slavery and perpetrate the most horrific genocidal murder upon. The bill to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, as Vermont and Maine and so many other states have already done, including this fine city of Newburyport, has less than 2 weeks to go before the deadline to get voted out of committee. That bill, S-2027H3191, needs our active support now on Juneteenth, so we don't continue honoring a slave trader on the second Monday in October every year. And we'll be speaking more on this and other Indigenous-backed legislation downstairs after the coffee hour, and I hope many of you will join us for that meeting. In Maine, as in other states, public school sports teams can no longer stereotype or discriminate against Indigenous people through the continued use of native sports mascots. Not so in Massachusetts, where 24 school districts still allow their use with face paint, the tomahawk chop and the bleachers, and native students characterized as brave warriors from kindergarten on. Maybe they're not brave warriors. Maybe they're poets, or maybe they're scientists or agronomists. Not cartoon caricatures. But in Massachusetts, the bill to ban the use of native mascots in all our public schools is once again stalled in legislative committee. The news comes late. Even as Mississippi in 2020 managed to take down their racist state flag with the Confederate stars and bars, consulting with native nations to come up with a beautiful new magnolia flag, here in progressive deep blue Massachusetts, we are still flying this flag. This is the last flag, state flag of white supremacy still flying in America, and it's shameful. And I'd say let's take a good look at it. Let's take a good look at it, but this one is so faded because it's been consigned to a dusty closet. It should be consigned to the dustbin of history, that we really can't see the features. But I'll tell you that one of the main features, as you may know, is that it shows an indigenous person, or at least the caricature of an indigenous person, carrying one downward pointed arrow and no quiver on his shoulder. Were he to be wearing a quiver, you might think this is an indigenous person ready to do battle. But indeed, this is not the intent of the designer of this symbol. The intent was to show a pacified Indian, a peaceful Indian. When the Puritans came over in 1630, they brought this symbol with them. It was the first seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it showed an indigenous person with one downward arrow and no quiver, just like today. Only in those days, the Massachusetts Bay Company Puritans had designed this before they'd even sailed over. So in 1629, they imagined the indigenous person might be wearing a loincloth made of leaves. Nobody in their right mind would consider that to be historically accurate, and that indigenous person would have a speech balloon coming out of his mouth, saying, this was on the original seal, "Come over and help us." So it has been a symbol of white supremacy since the start, since before the Puritans came over. And you can watch it go through its iterations down through the last few centuries, almost 400 years now. There was a brief period of time where we used a Paul Revere engraving and seal for the revolutionary government here in Boston during the Revolutionary War for 5 years. But after that, and that symbol showed an Anglo-American man carrying a sword and a copy of the Magna Carta. And after that, in 1780, they reverted back to what you see today, an indigenous person again with one downward pointed arrow. Only now it's got a sword above the indigenous person's head and a white hand holding the sword. And below the symbol of the indigenous figure is a Latin scroll that says, roughly, "She seeks a quiet peace under the sword, but peace only with liberty." There are many other features that are objectionable. For example, when the state codified this in 1898, and it's been the same ever since, it had changed many times prior to that, but when they made it into a law that it will look this way and no other way from now on until we change it, the illustrator Edmund Garrett used a photograph from the Bureau of Ethnography of a Chippewa chief from Montana, whom the illustrator considered to be a fine specimen of an Indian, although clearly not from Massachusetts. They used a skeleton of a native person dug up in Winthrop to make sure they had the bodily proportions correct, as if native people had different bodily proportions than we do, than any other race or ethnicity. might have. They used for the bow, they used the bow of a native person who was shot and killed by a settler in 1635 in Sudbury named William Goodnow. History does not record the name of the native person that he shot and killed, but the bow is on our state flag and seal. They used the belt that they considered to be the belt worn by Metacomet, who the English called King Philip, and to emphasize the relationship of the native person to the sword above his head, the Secretary of State at the time, William Oland, suggested, and the illustrator agreed, to use the sword that is kept in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth, that is thought to be the sword carried by Miles Standish. And if you know your history at all about Miles Standish, 2 years after the Wampanoags welcomed the Pilgrims to their shores and cared for them and fed them through the first winter of starvation so that half of them survived that winter. 2 years later, Miles Standish invited the leaders of the Massachusetts tribe to a private parley in what is now called Weymouth, then called Wessagusset, and ambushed them and killed them and cut off one of their heads and brought it back to his stronghold in Patuxet, now called Plymouth, and mounted it on a stake and let it rot there for 20 years. And that's the sword that they chose to put above the figure of the indigenous person wearing Metacomet's belt. And Metacomet met that same fate. And so Native people in Massachusetts remember this sword. And they have been calling for decades for us to do something about this. This is our flag. This is a shameful flag. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up now. And once again, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you on this matter, because it is a matter that has concerned people in 54 cities and towns enough to vote to send a message to the legislature that this needs to change. And we would love it if that happened here with your Newburyport City Council and in all the town meetings around Newburyport next year, because we are in the middle of a historic process of changing this. And finally, for the first time, the state legislators are sitting down with the leaders of three of the native nations of the area we now call the Commonwealth. The Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog are all seated on a special commission with 19 members, including the Secretary of State's office and many others, to recommend changes to the flag and seal. And it took them 16 months, but they finally agreed to actually do that, and that made statewide news the other day. The news continues to come late. But now they are going to make that recommendation to a legislature that for 36 years in a row stalled and killed the bill that Byron Rushing, the great African-American legislator from Boston, introduced in the beginning of the 1980s with the support of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs to change this shameful state symbol, which flies on the auditorium stage of every elementary school still, and it's on the side doors of every state patrol vehicle, and it's on the courtroom dais of every courtroom in the Commonwealth. And city halls and town meeting halls are mandated to display this flag. It's a shameful symbol. So Byron Rushing tried for 36 years to get the white majority legislature to change this flag, to set up a commission. And finally, he was defeated in a primary, and the next year, after enough pressure had been brought forward from so many towns and cities saying, we don't want to fly this flag anymore, they set up the special commission. It will make the recommendations, but as Jim Peters, who chairs the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, said right after they took that vote in the special commission, I hope it doesn't take the legislature another 35 or 40 years to act on our recommendations. So we need to keep the pressure on and get rid of this last flag of white supremacy still flying in the land. Byron Rushing would say, and he has said, if this flag showed a black person instead of an indigenous person with a noose over his head, we would have gotten rid of it long ago. And that's something we might consider here on Juneteenth. I'm going to close with just a brief quote from Sister Claire Carter from the Nipponzan Myohoji Peace Pagoda in my neighboring town of Leverett, who, with the other monks and nuns of that order, walked across the Commonwealth for 5 years to raise people's awareness and to stir the conscience of the Commonwealth to this symbol and the need to change it. And she says this: as we walked, we could begin to feel the weight of the Massachusetts seal and motto, a drawn sword over a native man's head, and the motto, "We seek peace by the sword, but peace only under liberty." White folks' liberty, to do as they wish, to establish absolute power over, without concern for, the suffering or loss experienced by the native population, particularly because the reality of these last 400 years is just beginning to surface, breaking through an enforced silence and denial. This state seal and motto seem to carry the weight of incomprehensible suffering. Oof. Although we definitely need to change the seal, we need also to feel in our bones, in our souls, what grief and violence and injustice this image is holding. We must spend time being with all of this and learn the history deeply. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I do hope that those who are able join downstairs for further conversation. And there are petitions for all of the surrounding towns, including, of course, Newburyport, to get signatures so it's brought to the councils of the towns. I know in particular that Rowley had denied this recently. So symbols matter. Symbols matter a lot. I've shared from this pulpit before. I just want to say this again. One of my dearest friends in ministry is a Black minister, Unitarian Universalist minister in Richmond, Virginia. And we were laughing and joking. We speak a lot. And I said, well, come here. Come here. Come here to Newburyport, in other words, and serve alongside me. And he stopped and he said, Reverend Rebecca, I can't come to Massachusetts. The only remaining white supremacist flag in the country. And it's so easy for us to look and say that them, those people, in those states. And so easy to say there's nothing we can do as individuals. And there is something we can do as individuals. There's a lot we can do as individuals. Indeed, it's the only thing each of us has as individuals, is to gather with others and use the power and the influence and the time and the gifts that we have. So let us do that for the good of all. Please rise in body or spirit, and let's join in our closing hymn, 1017. So it's in the teal hymnal, We Are Building a New Way. please join in our unison benediction while Nancy extinguishes the chalice. The words are in your order of service. May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us now and always. My friends, as we depart on this Juneteenth, on this June day before summer, on Father's Day, let us be brave enough to take action. Let us be brave enough to feel the love between us, the love for those that are our family and friends, which is everyone. Let us work for the good of all, the freedom of all, and then let us turn to those we love and embrace them in joy. Go in peace, my friends, and return again in great joy. Amen, and blessed be.